right, and welcome back to another iteration of this little game study podcast we're doing as an additional show to the Forever Classic podcast. I'm Alex McCumbers, and today it's all about zombies, the dark, and remakes, surprisingly. But today we're talking about Resident Evil 2, the 2019 remake of an iconic classic in the survival horror genre, and I couldn't think of anybody else on the team who would really, significantly add to this conversation more than Mr. Reese. Reese, how you doing, man?
I'm doing great. I'm ready to talk your ear off about Resident Evil 2, because one of my favorite games.
It's honestly one of my favorite in the franchise, and I really like this franchise, and we'll talk about, why we came to it. But so basically, for anybody unaware, Reese is a huge part of what we're doing, especially on the YouTube side at Forever Classic Games. So this might be the first time you're hearing him, but we've been at this together for probably about 6 or 7 months now, just Forever Classic.
7 months.
And then prior to that, we met through the Black Ice Esports stuff, and also did some really fantastic work there. So if you go looking for either Black Ice Esports or Forever Classic Games, there's a really good chance that Reese did the editing or the thumbnail for that. And then you've also been on YouTube for a while now. So introduce yourself a little bit. Let's talk you up to our listeners today.
All right. I'm Reese. I run a channel called Reset. It was also formerly known as Dynamite Penguins. It's a channel I've been running for over a decade now, just covering different game stuff. I've recently done a lot of video essays. Also, I've done a lot of stop motion animation, all kinds of stuff. Just really like games and kind of sharing my passion for them in different ways.
The stop motion pieces were always what really impressed me the most, as far as just a level of creativity and honestly just the reception of it. Some of those videos have multiple millions of hits. And I ran a YouTube channel 10 years ago coming out of college. And so I totally get the mindset of trying to figure out what you're even doing.
Yeah, it's definitely a process, just coming up with ideas and then just being surprised when people actually kind of receive it well.
Yeah, that's got to be super encouraging. I mean, you were 17 when you made those?
Yeah, a lot of those, sometimes younger. I started the channel when I was 11, so I was just making some screwing around, making some videos, and then some of them took off, and suddenly I started getting checks in the mail. I'm like, okay, I could do this instead of the usual maybe minimum wage job that I would start working at around my age. So
that's really, really cool, man.
So my first job was working independently, so that was cool.
That's such a cool little piece of your history, and obviously we're going to take that as far as we can, because you're hanging out with us at Forever Classic Games. You've done some really excellent review work, I gotta say. I have edited for a lot of people over the years, not nearly as many as some of my other editor colleagues, but it did not take long for you to get settled in and then be really effective at just the writing structure. So anytime I edit your stuff, I'm like, this is gonna be easy. At 20 minutes, do this, do that, fix a thing here, and I'm done, ready to go. It's really encouraging for me as somebody who has been mentoring a lot of people and trying to work around my own weaknesses and that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, really appreciate that. Yeah, I kind of wrote a lot for a lot of videos, and I have a lot of video essays, but definitely kind of changing into the style was kind of just the biggest thing. I probably needed a few reviews till it actually felt like a review and not me just doing my video essay thing where I go over every little detail.
Right.
Kind of had to tell myself, all right, that doesn't need to be in the review. That's you're getting into the very analytical.
This is probably the best advice that I've ever gotten as a writer. I forget who told me this. Maybe even one of the editors I had in college or something, or a senior classmate or whatever, a senpai, if you will. He was just at a certain point, you just gotta leave it alone. It's done. You did the work. Let it loose. Pull that ripcord and see what happens. And so for me, somebody who's always iterating with things, this is why you don't see a lot of my creative writing work existing in the space yet. Is because I just am always tinkering with things, right? And so this is also why we have multiple people working on editing the podcast still, because I get into real nitty-gritty of it, and I make sure things sound as good as I can make them.
The amount of times I've sat writing a paragraph for an uncomfortably long amount of time is I feel like I have rewritten the same sentence like 7 times, and it probably sounds about the same each time I've wrote it. But
Yeah.
now I'm happy with it for some reason.
It's something about being in the game space, especially, where I'm like, all right, I have like a day or two to write a thing. It's done. Goodbye. That's really encouraging, I think, because you get to see like the immediate effects. And even if it's like a piece that went out and nobody read it, at the end of the day, it's another notch in your belt because it's a thing you did that you can point to. And that's what I appreciate most about like this particular side of games media.
Oh yeah, definitely just being able to create something, get some instant feedback is really, always feels really good versus making, even just going back to making some animations. Yeah, it definitely feels good to like put something out there, but also it's like 3 months of your life and you put it out and it's like, man, I wish that was a little more instantaneous gratification than.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, so let's get into just Resident Evil in general. I'm really curious to know how you got into this franchise because I am very much aware that you're probably a bigger fan than I am. So, like, how did you get into shooting zombies?
Okay, well, this might sound crazy, but I had not played a Resident Evil game till last year.
Yo!
I didn't play any of them.
That's incredible.
So, my one of my brothers had a copy of 2 Remake, and I picked it up. I was getting footage. I just liked, when I was doing video essays, I liked having B-roll for anything. So I just captured footage for everything. So I just go into RE2. I'm not a horror game guy at the time. So I just play RE2, go into the gas station at the very beginning of the game. The first zombie is too scary for me. I can't handle it. And I get killed, and I'm like, turn the game off. That's it. And so it kind of became a running gag in my friend group that like I get killed by the gas station zombie, the very first zombie, and I can't even handle it. So eventually, over the holiday, not last year now, 2 years ago, I got Resident Evil 2 because I asked for it. I'm like, I'm gonna get rid of this running joke and I'm gonna beat the whole game. So I beat the whole game, and then I did it again and again, and I kept speed running it. And I'm like, I really enjoy this. And I ended up just kind of binging the rest of the series over the course of like a year. So I played 1 remake, 3 remake, played 4, 5, 6, regrettably, 7, 8, 0, and I think that's all I've played so far. Oh, I played the original 1. Still got to play a few, but I pretty much have speed ran the entire Resident Evil series in like a year, and now I'm kind of a quickly made super fan.
Yeah. So what's interesting to me is I went into this thinking like, oh, he really likes Resident Evil and has played 2 a lot. But the great irony is that you're the perfect person to talk to about this because this is the game that got you into the series.
Oh, yeah.
Recently. That's awesome.
Yeah, it wasn't even just Resident Evil, but I didn't like horror games, like, at all. And this game made me a horror game fan.
So aside from Resident Evil, what else you play? Because I know you at least are interested in Dead Space.
Yeah, I just picked up Dead Space. I played Eternal Darkness on the GameCube. That's a really weird, pretty obscure one. I recently played Outlast. So I've kind of just been getting into the horror genre because of this game.
That's really cool because I had a very similar situation happen to me with Resident Evil 4 on the PS2 when I was in high school. A friend of mine was like, you gotta play this, man. We swapped games a lot as a kid. And so he's like, you don't understand. Like, you need to play this, and I think you're really gonna like it. And so I have distinct memories of starting and stopping this game for the course of like a month or two. And it got to a point where like I was so deeply invested in what was going on, but so terrified to move forward. And then eventually, you beat it, and then you're like, I could beat that again. And this time I got the new weapon or whatever, or I'm going to do these extra chapters. The PS2 version of that game is fantastic because there's a lot of extras afterwards, which is my favorite aspect of the Resident Evil series generally. But like being able to kind of overcome that initial fear, but recognizing that fear and then chasing that, right? Like, because after Resident Evil 4, there was a time where I like explored this genre and was like, oh, okay, when Resident Evil 5 comes out, I want that. So I got it like day 1 at midnight at GameStop, right, for my 360. And I've been absolutely in love with the series ever since.
there was just kind of this thing. I mean, not only Resident Evil, but like no horror game experience. It was just kind of this great experience of just overcoming the fear, beating it, but then not only just beating it, but beating it into the ground
Yes.
and replaying it again and again until I could absolutely just destroy this game that made me want to piss myself originally.
Yeah. And it's still like, I played a little bit of RE2 Remake leading up to this, mostly as like an excitement thing for Resident Evil 4 Remake, which as of this recording is coming like within the next couple days. Check out foreverclassicgames.com for a lot of really cool content. The YouTube is going to have some really cool stuff and already has a couple videos on RE4. But I recently played the VR version on MetaQuest and I was like, this is sick. And then they were like, hey, we're also putting the VR version of RE4 Remake on PlayStation VR. And I'm like, uh-oh, now I need one of those. But it's really fascinating because, like, being able to beat something that effectively is very much encouraged in Resident Evil. And I would say that it's maybe one of the first games to, like, reward speedrunning in such a, like, significant way. Because a lot of these games, when you beat it at a certain time, it's not like in Metroid where you get to see maybe a little more skin of Samus, which we all adore and love, but you get like an infinite rocket launcher or a new costume or like a Tommy gun or, you know, what, like you're given just more toys to play with, which is always what really appealed to me about these games because I love unlocking things.
Oh yeah, definitely just going through the checklist and seeing all the different ways it wants me to beat the game. Like, don't open the item box for the entire game. Don't use any herbs, don't run around for this long, obviously just beat it in a certain time frame. Like all these things were just like, I love an excuse, just quickly run through it again.
There are a few franchises that encourage replayability like Resident Evil, and I think that's super commendable and a core part of this franchise, which is why I think RE3 didn't hit as well, because it was lacking a lot of that.
Well, you mean like the remake?
Yeah, the remake specifically.
Well, I kind of disagree with that. I think that did a pretty good job with it. I know people usually, the reception of that game is pretty mixed, especially...
Now, have they added additional scenarios or something since I played it? Because I played it at launch.
No, it's still just Jill. I think the replayability from that game is they have like a currency system for like the achievements.
Yep.
And you can like buy stuff, like you can get some key items ahead of time. You can buy different like weapons.
Oh.
So, and like different items that'll like increase your health, defense, and all that, and like your dodge. So you'd kind of play it, get a bunch of points, and probably go into it with maybe early key items, stronger moves and attacks, and maybe better guns. And I found that a lot of fun to just go through it again with better stuff, get more points, go through it again, and you just progressively get more powerful each run through, almost like a roguelite.
Okay, yeah, I can see your reasoning here. Yep.
So it's replayable for pretty different reasons, but I found the system to be pretty fun, even if there are a lot of other issues people have with the RE3 remake.
Gotcha. Well, let's really... So that's how we kind of give some credence to what we're talking about here today. Again, we are talking about Resident Evil 2 Remake, the 2019 release that was available on pretty much everything. This is a monumental release in the franchise and follows a equally monumental release in the source material, right? And so let's go into a little bit about the history of the game. So Resident Evil 2 came out in 1998 on the PlayStation, and it did fairly well. It sold, multiple millions of copies. But what makes it kind of interesting to me from just a PlayStation standpoint is that first game was really like something special. Like it specifically created the term survival horror right on the back of the box. It is a game that went on to inspire countless copycats and people iterating on that style of game. And so by the time you get to Resident Evil 2, they really wanted to do something like that would push that design forward. And so what they ended up doing was they created this 2-disc game. You, much like in the remake, you play as Leon one way and then Claire the other way, or you can play as Claire first and then do Leon. And so you would see, similar scenes from different angles or come across different key items at certain times. And so it was a really, like, for the time, a game that hit above what you expected with it, especially for the genre, which was starting to pick up by that point. And Capcom made a bunch of these, right? They made Resident Evil 3. They had the infamous Resident Evil 1.5. There was the director's cut. That 1.5 was never released, but it's an interesting like historical piece. And if you're interested, do a quick Google search of that. It's really fascinating. So the game went on to sell about 11 million copies. It's been ported to a lot of different things. Most interestingly, Resident Evil 2 is playable on the N64.
Yeah.
In its entirety on a single cartridge.
That's just insane.
And it was done by a company called Angel Studios based on what I was looking up. I remember this coming out and being like, well, what's it missing? Because I was really into the PlayStation. I loved my Final Fantasies, which had multiple discs. And I'm like, I'm pretty certain you're not going to be able to fit all this on here. Even my dumb little like 10-year-old mind was like, I don't know how this is going to work, man. But they did. And it works fairly well. Like, it's got all the stuff. I haven't played this version myself, but I have played the original PS1 version. I even streamed it, I think, actually, on the Forever Classic channel years ago when I was really into classic horror stuff. And so, like, it's fascinating to see just how far we've come.
Yeah, I believe the way they pulled that off, I think I watched a video on it, was they obviously compressed all the, like, cutscenes. But then they sliced, like, frames. They took out, like, every other frame and just, like, did 2 frames for each frame. So they lowered the frame rate of the cutscenes and just compressed the heck out of them until that didn't take up. Because I'm pretty sure that was what took up just the majority of the memory space.
Yep.
With just like probably a couple minutes of cutscenes.
Yeah, both Capcom and Square Enix were really like pushing the envelope for the cutscene side of CD-ROM tech, right? Like especially Square Enix. Even to this day, there's scenes that are on a Final Fantasy game that just look stunning because of the amount of like effort they put into it.
I mean, them being so like closely associated with PlayStation is partly because Nintendo went with cartridges instead of the discs that could really push forward what they were trying to do with those games.
Yeah, and that's this type of mentality, like this design of a survival horror game really carried Capcom clear into the PS2 because a lot of projects either start as a Resident Evil game and then get turned into something else, like a Devil May Cry or even the Onimusha series. But that same kind of like design philosophy is palpable in a lot of other titles. And it's fascinating when you're just playing it because you feel it. Like going from Resident Evil 2 to Onimusha 1, I was like, oh, of course these are the same people. Like, I get how this works and why it's cool and how it's different.
Definitely.
Have you ever seen this Tiger game version of Resident Evil 2?
The which version?
It's a handheld PDA. I owned one of these for a while. I think I eventually sold it. But the reason I bought it was because it was like $15. And I'm like, that's stupid. And then somebody's like, we got Resident Evil 2 for it. And I'm like, give me that shit. So I spent like $40, I think, total at a good friend of mine's old GameStop. Shoutouts to my buddy Casey. But that particular game like was just a fascination, and it was a collector's piece for me for a while. And it's a weird one. I think the person that covers this best, if you want some really cool like supplementary material, is Derek and Grace over at Stop Skeletons from Fighting. They cover Resident Evil exceptionally well, but they do a great job about this Tiger Gamecom thing.
Yeah,
it's
I didn't
weird,
even know
man.
that existed.
I think there is even a Game Boy Color version or two of some of these Resident Evil games. Like, they tried to put it on a lot of different places.
Yeah.
And so eventually, this led to the estimated, now this doesn't, I don't think, account for like ports on PS3 and stuff, but about 11 million copies for Resident Evil 2. That's a pretty good size as far as sales at the time, especially.
Yeah.
So this eventually turned into a lot of different ports. You've got, the Dreamcast version, you got PC, or at least Windows. I don't know if it's available on Steam in its classic form. But so there's like this legacy, right, of Resident Evil. And so at some point, Capcom were doing a lot of different ports on the GameCube, making a lot of different GameCube games. Eventually, they remade the original game with a whole new graphical style, a completely different like aesthetics and feel. And I think ultimately that's what led to what we have now, which is these really big, super scary versions with modern hardware and the RE engine and all this. But I think a lot of that started with that first Resident Evil remake. So you've played the Resident Evil 1 remake. I've played most of that on PS4 and then all of it on the DS of all things.
Oh, wow.
And the core DNA is there, man. Like, it's so weird, but the way that Capcom specifically elevated the original Resident Evil with that remake is astounding.
Oh, yeah. And what's really just crazy looking at that is, like, we see a lot of remakes that are coming out like a decade or so after, and people are like, with The Last of Us, like, this really soon to make the remake.
Mm-hmm.
Like, doesn't look like it graphically jumped that much with it, which I agree with. But
Right.
you look at the release date for the original Resident Evil and the remake, it's only like 6 years. And it's just
Mm-hmm.
insane how much those jumped.
The fidelity that they were able to squeeze into that original GameCube release is wild. And
Oh,
that's
yeah.
why, like, when they made the HD version of that, they didn't seemingly have to change a lot. But it
Oh,
looks
no. It looks
amazing
fine.
from an artistic standpoint. Like, it's, no matter how you play that remake, it's really, really cool. Funny story about the remake, though. So me and my stepbrother Marshall, who's been on the podcast before, check out our Final Fantasy VII remake deep dive. So me and Marshall spent a lot of time gaming together in our teenage years, and we really like noticed that both of us were super into like Capcom stuff. So we were like, well, let's pick up some more Resident Evil stuff. We both like Resident Evil 4. This game's awesome. And so we picked up the Wii version of the Resident Evil 1 remake and could not figure out how to move and took it back. And the great irony is both of us adore that game now and this franchise. So like we just didn't get it. The tank controls didn't make any sense to us.
Yeah, I mean, definitely take getting used to. But once you kind of get into them, they once you start working, you'll realize why they're there and how they kind of play into what the game is trying to do.
Yeah, I don't mind it, man. I think it's fine. Like if
Like,
I play the remake, which you can do a different control scheme now. There's a couple different options, but you can play in the tank controls. I just play in the tank controls usually.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fine with them. I played a lot of the games with them, but I wouldn't be mad at anyone if they're like, I can't play this.
Yeah,
It's
makes sense.
it's different. It's different from what people are used to now.
So they're after kind of the like this renaissance of Capcom, which was really kind of like spearheaded by the original release of Resident Evil 4, which completely changed the game for the franchise and for video games in general. That's where we started to see like the third person shooter really come into shape, and RE4 is a big part of that.
Oh yeah, I mean the whole style of game, like, because I only recently got into these games. It was just kind of that aha moment where you kind of realize so much of what I've been playing for over a decade kind of dates back to this game.
I love doing that type of thing. Like whenever I'm talking to a developer and they're like, "Oh, I got this really specific mechanic from this like super obscure Super Nintendo game," I'm like, I'm gonna go play that, and that's a really fun exercise for me. I do the same thing in most media. Like, me and my partner have been reading a lot of Dune, because Dune is also another thing that builds off to a lot of other things. And so now that we've read 3 books of Dune and watched the movie and, you know, watched the David Lynch version and all this stuff, like, you start seeing that DNA in everything. It's crazy.
Oh yeah.
But so Capcom had this weird period right around after Street Fighter 4 kind of got big. And you could probably mark this specifically with the release of DMC Devil May Cry, which people like in hindsight, but certainly were mad about it at the time. I think it sold well enough. And Resident Evil 6. So those 2 releases, I think, really mark the, like, probably some of the lowest moments in Capcom's development and publishing history. But following that, and it's funny because Resident Evil 6 was, until very recently, one of their most profitable video game releases.
Oh yeah, and so
it was
was
like
5.
number 3 or something, like maybe even number 1 until Monster Hunter came out. But anyways, so
yeah, I'm pretty sure it was 5 and 6 were like at the top for
Yeah.
Monster Hunter.
yeah, 6
So it's
sold
like
way better than you would think.
Yeah, so while the reception and like among fans isn't very high, like in
Right.
terms of sales, they kind of what they did, their strategy was working.
Oh,
And
yeah.
you think they might have just kept going along with that, but they
wonder
didn't.
how much of those sales were just, hey, we got Leon back.
Yeah,
Remember this guy? That's a weird game. It's
can't
like,
pick a character, so here's every character.
yeah, it's surprisingly innovative in very specific and weird ways. Like, I love playing Mercenaries mode in RE6. That shit's great.
Yeah, I mean that's what I hear most about. It's just the combat's very good and people
Yeah.
enjoy that, but just
The
the
campaigns
game's
are
the game's
poorly
too
structured.
long. The game's
Yeah.
too long. There's too many
It's like
too many
60
characters
hours or something. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, because when I marathoned all the games, I had 6 for last. I waited
Yeah.
to play 6, so I played all the other like numbered entries. And I was
Now,
just
have you
like,
done Code Veronica? Because that's been staring me down for years.
no, I
Okay.
haven't played that one yet, but I know it's on PlayStation Plus, which I have. So I've been meaning to play that one soon because I guess that's the last one I have to play that's considered a mainline entry.
Yeah, I've played the first maybe 2 or 3 hours on the Dreamcast once. That's a really cool game that I can't wait to sit down and go back to. And honestly, that might be the first thing I install onto my Steam Deck whenever it comes in.
Yeah, so still got to play that. Maybe that one will get a remake as well.
If they're
knows?
going to do a remake, that makes the most sense. Like if
Yeah.
they do another one, which based on the numbers, we can probably assume.
I've been wondering if they'll just remake the first one again, but like
With this
in
new
the,
style?
in the current style, just because they already have 2, 3, and 4. I feel like it's kind of weird that they have the original trilogy,
Yeah.
but the first remake is the pretty normal
Yeah, it's different
camera
compared to
angles
this like
until
new thing.
not tilt controls, tank controls. So
But
maybe they'll go
anyways,
through that.
the thing that really kind of marks this like jump in quality, because Capcom has been on a tear for the past like 8 or 9 years, is the release and the production of Resident Evil 7, which is very much inspired by like American horror cinema. We're talking Evil Dead, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. They're like, we want to scare people again. And then they made it a Resident Evil game, and it works, right? Like, I would say that RE7 has a lot of DNA of the original game, and if you play both next to each other, you can really feel that. But so what they did was they had all these different outsourcing studios, right? And this is how things kind of got like muddied. So they had a lot of projects going on at once. And so they shifted all that development internally to Japan. And we're like, we're going to work on fewer things with bigger ideals, and we're going to take some risks. And so they made Resident Evil 7. And while Monster Hunter World comes out like a year or two after this, they were almost assuredly developed in some sort of tandem, right? And so they ride off the critical and commercial success of RE7 and then have another banger, like immediately. And then they release Monster Hunter World, which is their most profitable piece of media, period. Like, Monster Hunter World is one of the best-selling games on that platform and for Capcom, and it, like, I cannot wait for that sequel. So this is what happened. Capcom are now, like, in the best creative position they've ever been, because they've got all their people, they've got the right, like, creative minds, they're taking really interesting risks with properties that people love, and now they have the money to back it. And they're like, do it again. Let's remake Resident Evil 2. And the moment I saw that RE2 was getting a remake, I was like, oh, hell yes. Give it to me. And then it came out. A couple years go by. We get, some very cool free stuff for Monster Hunter. But for the most part, Capcom is supporting Monster Hunter, working on a lot of different things. Resident Evil 2 remake comes out in 2019, and it's glorious. Like, I love Resident Evil 7. I think Resident Evil 2 currently is my favorite like modern Resident Evil release, period. It's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably biased being that was my first one, but
right.
Still I went back and played all the others, and I don't think anything matches 2 remake for me. It's close. I really enjoyed, like, I think my other top ones are like 8, 7. I've really liked the recent ones. I'm sure some people like the classic style are not sure about the newer ones, but definitely for me, like, I love what they've been doing.
If you like classic zombie horror and genuinely think that there's an opportunity to have scares there, Resident Evil 2 is probably the perfect zombie game. The only thing that this game is lacking, in my opinion, is a horde mode without a timer. I think if you had just a regular horde mode where you survived in a space and were given infinite amount of time, I think that the game would literally be perfect, because that's the only other thing you would want in a zombie game, right? Is how long can I make it?
Yeah, man.
And it's so good. Like, the reason I think Resident Evil 2, by comparison with the other games that they've released, is so noteworthy is because of all the extra things you can do once you beat the game. Again, you have 4 different routes, technically. You either start with Leon, start with Claire, and then follow up with either to get an A and B route. But you also have these DLC scenarios which talk about, like, Kendo, the gun owner, various other characters. Hunk makes a return, and then you get tofu runs and like skins that are the PS1 models just injected into this game. Like, there's so many cool ways to play this.
Absolutely. I mean, not even the tofu. There's five different like versions of that run.
Yep.
You get like flan, like other tofu I can't think of off the top of my head.
So what's funny is I beat this game mostly on Steam, right? Like, I did everything except for the hunk and the tofu run. But whenever the PlayStation version came out and they like upscaled the 4K or whatever on PS5, I actually reached out to representative of Capcom and like, I would love to take another crack at these in the 4K. And so I finally got to do that. Shoutouts to the people who supported me in that. Sorry. I really should have done this way sooner. But so now we're taking like a collective look at this game, and that's the version that I've been playing, is the PS5 version, which I play on a little 4K screen. It looks great. The lighting, I think, could be improved with an OLED. So maybe next time I get a 4K, I'm going to pick up an OLED because I play a lot of horror games. But the sound design in RE2 Remake is really what pushes it over the edge. There's so many things you can do in that game with just sound alone, and it genuinely made me jump like yesterday. And I know this game like the back of my hand, right?
Yeah. I mean, even after 20 playthroughs, I've beaten this game like 20 times.
Yeah.
I still jumped a few times because the zombie, they're never exactly in the same spot. Every time, they're always somewhere different.
And they're very sporadic. They're hard to like pin down.
These are the best zombies in any game I've played. They're unpredictable. The way they shamble is just horrifying. Their faces are horrifying.
You never know when you kill them, really.
Yeah.
Is there a way to know? I know that was a major complaint when the game first came out from speedrunners.
Once they're down, if you take like a second and shoot them again, if you shoot them and they move, they'll get up. But like, usually you can tell they're dead because you'll shoot them, they'll fall. You shoot them or knife them again, and they don't react. So
but there's not like a definitive, because in a lot of Resident Evils, you can count the bullets, right? Like, if I put 3 shots in the head with this weapon, they're done. And then I can use that to
randomized.
Yeah,
it's completely randomized.
That's the one like mechanical criticism I've seen people really kind of harp on for this game. But because of that unpredictability, I think it makes for a really fascinating experience.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if it was the same every time, it wouldn't be the same game.
Right.
If I knew, okay, I need this many bullets to take out this enemy and get through, it's like, no, you could come up to a zombie with 5 bullets and just be out, and you're out of luck. You need to either dodge or take a bite.
And I did have my numbers backwards earlier. It's 6 million copies of RE2 across N64 and PS1. 11 million so far, I think as of January 2023 even, like Capcom released some sales information. Because they do just publicly share like estimates. That's not exact, and video game data is a very weird science, but over 11 million copies and probably a lot more on the way just because of how much longevity there is to these releases now. Because what happens is somebody like you sits down, plays it, and thinks, this is incredible. What else is there?
Yeah.
And then here pretty soon, we're going to have the same dynamic with a game that sold way more and has way more influence, RE4. And a lot of reviewers have said, yep, this might be the best one they've done.
Yeah.
And so we'll see.
Yeah, and with the main character being Leon, there's definitely there's going to be a sales spike of 2 as well.
People like Leon. Yep. And RE2 is his origin, right? Like, this is the first time we see him canonically in the story. Weird story, by the way. Lore. So the lore in Resident Evil is wacky and fascinating, and I hope it's going in a particular direction after Village. Because there's like an eldritch thing that you discover that they're like, we're not sure where this thing comes from, but maybe it's what they use to make the T-virus. And it's like, ooh, give me details on that. And I think generally that's what they're sprinkling through all of these remakes. But I want to see them do something with that and like commit to it.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I mean, I think it's just funny because it's been going on for so long. They still just try to, they've never thrown away or given up on the story. They're going to continue trying to make this crazy amalgamation of events somehow still work together in a timeline.
Don't jump into, like, if you're somebody who really likes narrative, don't jump into Resident Evil thinking you're going to get something beginning to end. Just go along for the ride. Like, do it like you do other titles as far as, like the lore of Dead Space is similar, right? Like, I think it actually has a definitive end that's kind of satisfying, but in Resident Evil, they're constantly contradicting themselves throughout the entire franchise. They're screwing up, like, timeline shit all the time. And so now these remakes kind of feel like there might be at least something that's fairly
they're
solid.
taking the opportunity to
Yeah.
keep things solid, because I mean, just even back then, like, it was just less common to really have a lot of this stuff kind of marked down and keeping continuity.
And that's just the overall lore. The actual moment-to-moment drama, the character things, the stakes are always really high. Pretty much every game gives you some sort of dramatic way to end. Usually it's an explosion because it's an action series. But if anything, you always get a definitive, like, I did it feeling at the end of these.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're looking for a very serious story, you just got to go along with whatever they say or do, but they'll always make it enjoyable.
Yeah, so Resident Evil 2, generally, as far as, like, historical importance, it's really fascinating to chart out just how far the publishing of Capcom's video games has gone. And it's really fun to just even load up some of the older titles, because no matter how you play them, you'll probably get something out of them. Like, I could argue that Mega Man Legends on the PS1 is still totally playable and holds up artistically. And not a lot of publishers get to say that. Even some of Capcom's earliest works, I'm talking NES shit, all of that is, like, weirdly representative of their respective platforms and still hold up. If you show somebody Mega Man 2 on the NES, which is coming, by the way, on this Game Study podcast, it looks like a cool contemporary video game, right? Like, the pixel art still looks fine.
And I think it just helps that Mega Man may not be the best example, but they've kept a lot of the franchises around here alive, and they've kept new entries, and then it kind of, like, just being able to go back and see that DNA is a little more appreciative than if I'm going back to an old game that doesn't have an ongoing legacy.
Right. So is there anything in particular, because we've talked about the broad strokes a lot as far as why we like Resident Evil 2 Remake. I think generally we can both agree that this is a fantastic release, and we highly recommend it for anybody who's into not even horror, but just action games in general. It's a really good time. But is there anything in specifics that we haven't touched on that you really want to highlight?
Well, I would just want to say the way I would recommend it is just I didn't even like horror games till I played this. And so even if you do not like horror, I would say try it, because it is one of my favorite games of all time, and I went in not even enjoying the genre at all. But that's kind of how I would pitch the game.
Yeah, and it's
a game I think everyone should at least try.
Yeah, and this new series that we're doing for this podcast is kind of off to a great start, because our last one was Nier Automata, which is also a highly recommended video game. I would argue that Resident Evil 2 is even more recommended, as far as, like, the amount of people in broad strokes that will find something cool in this is much larger than Nier.
Oh yeah, I mean I haven't played Nier. I have no authority to talk on that subject, but just Resident Evil is a very, very beginner-friendly horror game, and there's a reason why it's selling those 10 million copies with every release. It's just very accessible and a very solid horror game. And
what's also funny, too, is things in video games and media are very cyclical. They go in cycles, right? I mean, we see this even back in the early 90s. Fads would come and go, right? That was the whole thing. As a kid, you could never keep up with the fads because the fads are always moving. But in video games, Resident Evil, the original PlayStation release, inspires the survival horror genre. We get things like Silent Hill and furthermore. And then Resident Evil 4 comes out, inspires the third-person shooter genre, and furthers that. Then we get Resident Evil 7, which was partially inspired by, at least a little bit, some of the work that Kojima was doing on the playable teaser, or maybe not inspired, but at least you could make that comparison.
Yeah, I've heard mixed things. Some people say it was, some people say it wasn't, but there's definitely some stuff that aligns.
Might be one of those coincidences where everybody's just kind of in the same wavelength around the same time. It happens.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely can happen when people are being introduced to a lot of the same, like, dev kits and technology around the same time. They're all kind of seeing what new stuff they can do.
Yeah, so anyways, Resident Evil 7 inspires a whole, like, uptick of horror titles. And then we get Resident Evil 2 Remake, and then 3, and now 4. And now that we're looking down the barrel of 4, there has been the Metroid Prime remake, the Dead Space remake, like, high-budget horror games have really come into fashion once again, and it's absolutely because of what Capcom are doing at Resident Evil.
I didn't know Metroid Prime was a horror game, but
It kind of feels like a horror game.
At
But
times,
either way, these
the
like
Chozo ghosts are pretty scary.
these big budget remakes are clearly making hand over fist.
Oh yeah.
Final Fantasy VII, some of the biggest things we got going on are remakes, right? Like, it's weird to me, but it's really exciting because I've liked most of them.
I mean, it can be pretty safe, although I'd say a lot of these remakes, particular ones, haven't played it very safe. Final Fantasy VII didn't play it very safe. It went in a very different direction from what I've heard.
Mm-hmm.
And RE4, we're already seeing a lot of different stuff, so they're not playing entirely safe, but I think that's kind of a way for them to have security with their game. They're like, we know this will probably do well because people are nostalgic for it and it's already done well. So it's safe and we can kind of experiment within those boundaries of the game.
I'm appreciative that a lot of developers, when they're tasked with this in particular, is that they want to create the feeling of playing the game at the time and not necessarily like the exact method of playing the game. So when you jump into something like the Dead Space remake or RE2, like, they're taking what you imagined or your impressions of the game at like a super young age, or, you know, the best pieces that people find the most memorable, and then making that in a modern lens. And the whole process is fascinating to me, but Resident Evil is such a cool case study because the original games are so influential and still good.
I mean, definitely had a lot of people would say they declined with around like 5 and 6 and stuff, but like, I think those games both hold up in their own ways.
Yep.
Just, there aren't a lot of series you can say they've been along for as long as they have and still just have been high quality across pretty much 30 years.
Now, one of the benefits in Capcom's favor right now with the legacy titles is they've done a pretty good job keeping them going. And we're going to see this pretty soon with the Mega Man Battle Network collection, which has an online, like, competitive mode and shit. Like, there's a lot of things that they're doing to preserve their legacy, which I always appreciate in publishers. Square Enix does this pretty well, but Capcom does this, like, really well.
Yeah, they've kind of figured everything out.
Mm-hmm. Like, when I sit down at my computer and I think to myself, I want to play Resident Evil 4, there are so many different ways to play that.
Oh,
and
yeah.
That's awesome, because if I have a Switch, I can throw it on the Switch. If I do it on my PC, there's a Steam version. There's usually like a lot of updates and stuff that are made by these developers for legacy games to make them either run better with modern hardware or have extra enhancements. Like, have you ever seen Quake or something in like ultra wide? Awesome. That stuff is really cool.
Yeah, anyways a company can show that they respect the legacy and want to preserve their games. It's something I'm completely in support of.
Because I think even though a lot of sales trends still favor releases that are annual and are really like general, I'm talking things like, you know, Call of Duty, Grand Theft Auto, Madden, Mario Kart even.
Some people probably wish Grand Theft Auto was yearly.
Well,
it's more like a decade. Once a decade now.
Thank goodness there's a lot of like community-made content. Otherwise, that game would not be as popular as it is, I don't think. But these really like mass appeal games that sell multi-million copies, right? Like, even with that in mind, it feels like now more than ever, people have the ability and are encouraged to pick up games that are either older and have modern improvements, or have been re-released or reported. Like, anytime that a game is made more available, I think ultimately it's just better for players, right? Like,
yeah,
you can jump into, like, GOG is such a great advocate for this. Like, a lot of their PC games their whole business model was just taking old abandoned things on PC and making them available, and then, you know, adding everything you would want for it, right? Like, the fact that the modding community is so readily accessible through like Steam is wild.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy how much that stuff can just be done by fans. Doesn't even need official implementation. Don't tell them about it. But, you know.
Thankfully, Capcom traditionally has been, you know, fairly relaxed as far as taking things down.
Yeah, but any chance they have to preserve it, I think a lot of companies just kind of realize we can resell this.
Yeah.
And people will buy it. And we don't have to do much work. It's like, that's crazy. Yeah.
If you just make things available and there's a reason to play it, no matter what that reason is, somebody somewhere will buy it. Yeah. And if you make that available to as many people as possible through a platform like Steam or adding extra languages or what have you, you can just rake in money indefinitely. That's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, not to say like porting stuff is just free. It's not, you don't just drag and drop a file. But like,
no, there's a lot of little things you gotta do to make that happen. And
but relative to the cost that you're probably gonna get out of it, it's like get people on your games. Get your old games on any store you can. Really appreciate. There's no reason not to.
Especially for the Mega Man classics, like a lot of those collections are really, really cool. And we just saw, I haven't played this one, but people keep recommending it to me, is the Atari collection is like a playable museum. And that's like the new innovative way to capture legacy content. Thank goodness we live in a world where emulation is still like existing and thriving because of platforms like the Steam Deck or like the Raspberry Pi or whatever. Because at the end of the day, when a release goes out, that needs to be available, I think, personally. Whether it's some random Super Nintendo ROM that most people forgot about, there's still value to that by its very nature. And that's the type of stuff that I like to pursue. And so, all to say, Resident Evil is better now than it's ever been, probably. And it's such a good time to jump into these games. You can get them on PS4. Technically, you can play RE2 on Switch. I don't recommend it because it's a cloud game. But these are all readily available. They're often on sale. You can buy them with all the DLC included. And I paid $2 yesterday, actually, to get all the unlockables in RE2 because I already beat it on Steam and I didn't have the time, right? So I'm like, you know what? $2, unlock all the things. I'm actually okay with that.
Yeah, I might need to do that because I platinumed on a different PlayStation. It wasn't on my account, so I'm like, oh, starting fresh.
Right.
Might as well just get all my stuff back.
I still haven't gotten a platinum. I have one on my account. We talked about this in the last episode because Gina beat Lego Star Wars in its entirety. And so that was my first platinum. But I mean, the platinum experience is a whole nother aspect to this, right? Like that was an enjoyable process for you, I imagine.
Oh yeah. I mean, I don't know if I platinumed any other game other than the RE3 remake, which I also platinumed.
Yeah.
I don't platinum games. That's not really something I've done a whole lot of.
Okay.
I'll usually complete the game with the objectives in the game itself, but I've never really been an achievement hunter. But yeah, with these games, I was looking for any reason to replay it again. So I mean, they could add more trophies if they want, and I'll go back in and get those too.
Right? Yeah. Like now I'm thinking on, because I love the modding scene. I don't get to interact with it as much as I would like, but there's an upcoming mod that I think is pretty close to being done, and it's a Dark Souls 3 mod called like Arcvale or something, right? Like it's a complete rework. They basically just took the Dark Souls 3 framework and made another Dark Souls 3 with all new monsters and shit. And I'm like, I want to play that. That sounds awesome. So I wonder if this is available in Resident Evil. Like, I wonder how moddable the RE engine is. And there's rumors that the RE engine is kind of like showing its age. I kind of hope they just release that to the public. Because you know what we're going to see first? Dino Crisis. Somebody's going to make that shit somewhere. If they're not already.
I don't know how likely it is that Capcom will do that. But, you know, that would certainly be pretty nice to see everyone.
If we're going to get another remake in this style, it'll either be Code Veronica or Dino Crisis. Those are the two most likely. But I think Code Veronica is the most logical next step.
Yeah. I've heard people throw around the idea of even redoing 5 and 6, but kind of the opinion there's nothing inherently wrong with it. The stuff that people don't like about those games are more just the full tone and core of the game.
Right, yeah.
Like,
and
I still enjoyed going through 5 with a co-op partner. It's still a fun co-op game. Mm-hmm. Just if people want it to be more in line with being horror and probably a little more serious, that's a completely different game. At that point, I'd rather have them just put more of their effort toward 9.
There's certainly some undertones of Resident Evil 5 and 6 that I'm not appreciative of, and there's a bit of that floating around for even the original Resident Evil 4 of like, you know, you're essentially a white savior that goes in and kills a bunch of foreign people. That's probably not great. So that's the sort of thing, like, because that is an inherent part of Resident Evil 5, I think it's a lot harder to remake. Like, they would have to completely change how that game flows if they want to avoid that particular side of the criticism of that game.
Yeah.
I don't think it's worth it. I think you just leave it alone.
It's a much bigger overhaul, and those games already don't have although their sales numbers are big, they don't have the legacy that
there's not
3 or 2
100 million people being like, yeah, I would love to play Resident Evil 6 again.
Yeah, I mean, just you put Resident Evil 2 or 4 on a game case, and it's like, well, you already made your sales, so
yeah, just by the general idea of it, right? Like, I feel like a lot of game purchases are made on the general idea. If you're like, I love Dead Space, I want to play the Dead Space.
I feel like
when's the last time I played Dead Space?
I feel like that's why we have RE4 right now instead of Code Veronica. It's much more marketable to just do this one first.
I wouldn't be surprised, and this comes partially because of that huge leak that happened at Capcom a while back. And so a lot of the things that we saw in that initial leak probably 5 or 6 years ago, give or take, all of that is steadily coming true. So these things are built like with multiple year plans. It wouldn't surprise me if when they started with the concept of remaking RE2, that they were shooting for RE4. And so this whole time they've been building with the subconscious in mind of like, oh, we're getting pretty close to a really good one. And so, of course, when RE4 hits, it's got to be incredible, right? Like, they had to put everything they had into it.
Oh, yeah, because they pulled, I think they had the team or at least the team that was working on 3 remake, they started development on 4. And I'm pretty sure they pulled them off of the game and put the team from 2 remake onto 4 remake.
So I think they saw always have somebody working on 4.
Yeah, so it seemed like they saw the reception to 3 was mixed, and they knew how important it was to get the RE4 remake right, and they pulled the team off and put the RE2 team, because that game was better received, and they put that team on RE4. So they definitely have been trying to really make sure this game is as good as it is, and judging by Metacritic so far, it looks like it paid off.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't put a whole lot of faith in Metacritic, but generally the reaction has been overwhelmingly positive. And even people who are like, kind of like people like me and Justin and such, who have been in this for a really long time, and it's hard to surprise us sometimes. And it's hard to get through that fog of, oh man, next week I got to play this other thing, or I got to be done with this in like a day or two. Even those sorts of people, the tired, just like day-to-day games journalist, those folks are saying this is special, and that means something, I think. Like, I cannot wait for this release. I absolutely adore Resident Evil 2. I like Resident Evil 3 a lot, even though I don't like it nearly as much as 2. And I think that it's definitely a game worth checking out. So to kind of wrap us up here, check out Resident Evil. But Reese, if people wanted to find you, where might they do that? And while you're doing that, I'll look at the schedule so people can prep.
Well, if you want to find anything I do, you can either go to my Twitter, reset at resetyt _YT, or you can go to my YouTube channel. If you look up Reset, you'll probably be the first result there, hopefully. And those are the main places you can usually find me. Of course, I also do content on the Forever Classic YouTube channel. So if you watch something there's a good chance I either worked on it or at least made the thumbnail. So anything there, anything of those 3 you can support is very much appreciated.
Very cool. And of course, we can't recommend also, with any of the authors that we have, we always encourage there being a little tip button. So if you're reading an article, or if you're thinking, man, this Reese guy is kicking ass, throw him a $5 or something, buy him a coffee. We highly recommend that as we get into this like business phase, right, of games media. But ultimately, we're going to keep that ad free for you and make it as clutter free as we can, while also just doing things a little differently in games media. Coming up next for this particular game study show, so if you want to play along, the next episode is going to be Mega Man 2 on the NES. A lot of us are going to be playing that, I think, on the Legacy Collection or through an emulator or something. So anyway, you can get that game, check it out. And then after that, we're going to be hitting Tunic, which is a very classically minded game that's got a lot of really cool stuff in it. And I don't think most of us on the team has even played it at all or tried it out. So we're all really excited to give Tunic a full pass. And then lastly, after that, we got Castlevania Symphony of the Night, fan favorite of the series, and we are really excited to revisit it and check out all the weird secrets. And then if you want a sneak peek at the bigger game that'll take a lot more time, we are eventually going to be talking about Final Fantasy IX on this show, and we hope to be hitting that sometime in the summer. So if you pick up the game now and play it sporadically over the next few months, you can finish it alongside us. But yeah, so if you're interested in what we're doing, check out foreverclassicgames.com. It is a clutter-free games and geek culture site that is completely free. You don't have to pay anything in order to read our stuff. And it's completely owned and operated independently. There's no other companies involved. It's me and Zach and a bunch of awesome volunteers. So if you want to check us out, find us. You can check out that YouTube channel. Just look for Forever Classic Games. Same with Twitch. And then on Twitter, it's Forever X Classic. We're also on Facebook, Instagram, anywhere you might find a games media outlet. We're probably there. And then our podcasts come out every Monday. So if you want to throw us into your rotation and your schedule, we would love to have you. And if you want to share that with a friend, that would be even better. So yeah, stay cool. Play some games. I'm Alex. This was Reese. This was a great chat, man, first off.
Yeah, enjoyed being here. And could always talk more about Resident Evil 2.
Yeah, we'll have you on future podcasts for sure. All right, so y'all have a damn good one, and we'll see you next time.